On the day of her wedding graces, faithful German Shepherd Hugo stood in her way as she tried to walk down the aisle. The guests immediately fell into silence. For more than 10 years Hugo had been her constant companion. At first she assumed he was simply anxious, but what she soon uncovered would change her understanding of love forever. Grace stopped in her tracks, her dress flowing around her as Hugo leaned against her legs. He didn't bark or growl, he just stared at her with such intensity that it sent a shiver down her spine. "Hugo, come on, buddy," she whispered. Trying to move him, he wouldn't budge. The murmurs grew. Her father reached for the leash. "Grace, we need to get moving," he urged. Hugo let out a low growl, making even her father hesitate. Grace's heart sank. Hugo never growled. She knelt, her dress pooling around her, and cued his face. "What's wrong, boy?" she murmured, stroking his graying muzzle. Then she saw it, the labored, breathing, trembling legs, her breath hitched. Something was terribly wrong. "Grace," her mother called out, her voice edged with impatience. "We're running out of time. What's going on?" But Grace paid no attention to anything except Hugo, the one who had been by her side through every sorrow and victory. She leaned in, pressing her forehead gently against his. "I'm here, Hugo," she whispered. "I'm not leaving you." As she helped him sit, his body leaned heavily against her. The guests whispered in confusion, but Grace heard none of it. Hugo's amber eyes pleaded with her, as if trying to say something words couldn't express. "Hugo," she whispered again, voice breaking. Her fiancé, Lucas Bennett, stepped forward, concern on his face. "Grace, is everything okay?" he called softly. She looked up at him, then back at Hugo, the knot of unease tightening in her chest. Grace's father crouched beside her. "Grace, we can't wait much longer. The ceremony needs to begin." She barely registered the words, her mind drifting into memories. Hugo as a scruffy puppy, trembling during a thunderstorm. Hugo standing watch during her worst heartbreaks. Hugo sprinting through the park the day she met Lucas. He had always been her anchor, and now something was terribly wrong. Without hesitation she decided, "We're going to the vet," she said firmly. Her mother gasped. "The wedding can wait," she added, standing and gathering her skirts. She turned to Lucas, her voice soft. "I'm sorry, but I can't leave him like this." Lucas didn't hesitate. "You don't need to apologize. Hugo comes first." Stunned guests watched as Grace, still in her wedding dress, led Hugo to her car. Lucas followed, calling the emergency vet, while her father explained to the minister. As they separated, Grace's attention remained solely on the dog who had devoted 13 years to loving her. Hugo pressed against her, his breaths shallow but steady, placing his full trust in her. The car sped toward the vet. In the back seat, Grace cradled Hugo's head in her lap, her wedding dress pooling around them, lace wrinkled and smudged. Hugo's breathing was labored, each shallow rise and fall of his chest like a countdown. Lucas kept glancing in the rearview mirror, jaw tight. "We're almost there," he reassured her, though his grip on the wheel said otherwise. Grace brushed away a tear, stroking Hugo's graying muzzle. "I should have realized," she murmured. "He's been acting differently all week. I thought it was just the wedding chaos." But Lucas's voice was steady yet gentle. "You couldn't have known. What matters is that you're here now." The clinic came into view, its lot glowing under warm lights. Dr. Peterson, Hugo's longtime vet, was already waiting. As they pulled up, he stepped forward, helping them inside. Grace carried Hugo, her wedding dress trailing behind her. Forgotten, the clinic smelled of antiseptic and pine, a strangely comforting mix. Dr. Peterson guided Hugo onto the exam table, working with quiet concentration as Grace kept a hand on her dog. Lucas wrapped an arm around her. Minutes felt like hours. Finally the vet looked up, his expression full of sympathy. "Sorry for the interruption. Before we continue with the story. I kindly ask you to like the video and subscribe to this channel. It is very important for us. Thank you very much. Hugo is an advanced heart failure. Dr. Peterson said softly, his voice carrying the weight of the news. The stress of the day has worsened his symptoms. Medication can help keep him comfortable, but we're looking at months, not years. The room seemed to spin around her, the walls closing in as the reality of his words settled in. Grace gripped Lucas's hand tightly, her knuckles turning white. Is he in pain? She whispered, barely able to find her voice. Dr. Peterson shook his head gently. No, he assured her with quiet certainty. But stopping you from walking down the aisle? That was his way of asking for help. Tears welled in Grace's eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she leaned forward, pressing her forehead to Hugo's. His fur was warm beneath her touch, his breathing steady but weak. I'm so sorry, buddy, she murmured, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. Lucas cleared his throat, steady as always, his presence grounding her. What's the next step, Doc? He asked, his voice firm but calm. How do we make sure he stays as comfortable as possible? Dr. Peterson began outlining a treatment plan, speaking in careful, measured tones, but Grace barely heard him. Her mind swirled in a fog of emotions. The wedding, the guests, her parents, it all felt so distant, like something happening to someone else. She turned to Luke, her voice surprisingly steady despite the storm inside her. I need to stay with him, she said firmly, her decision made in an instant. Lucas didn't hesitate, not for a second. He simply nodded. Then we stay, he said, his hand tightening around hers in silent support. Before she could say another word, the clinic door swung open with a quiet creak. Grace, her father's voice, filled the small space as he stepped inside, followed closely by her mother, the minister, and Sophie, her maid of honor. We thought you might need some support, her father said, his usual strong demeanor softening as his gaze fell on Hugo. Her mother, always composed, was already dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, unable to hold back her emotions. Sophie lifted her phone, her expression determined yet gentle. The guests understand, she said, but maybe we don't have to cancel the wedding. Grace blinked, her breath catching. What do you mean? She asked hesitantly. The minister offered a kind smile. If you're willing, he said, we can hold the ceremony here with Hugo by your side. Grace's heart tightened, emotion rising in her throat. She turned to Lucas, searching his face for any hesitation, any doubt. It's not the wedding we planned, he said softly, his eyes full of understanding. But it feels right. Grace let out a tearful laugh, the weight of the moment pressing into her chest. She nodded, gripping his hand even tighter. Let's do it in an hour. The clinic became an impromptu wedding venue, filled with love and warmth. Sophie adjusted Grace's dress and veil while Lucas straightened his rumpled tuxedo. Grace found him perfect. The minister took his place with Hugo lying at their feet, wagging his tail as if he understood. As Grace and Lucas exchanged vows, their hands tightly clasped, Grace felt an unshakable certainty. It wasn't the wedding they planned, but surrounded by those who mattered. It felt even more right when the minister finally pronounced them husband and wife. Hugo let out a quiet, approving woof. The sound was soft but full of meaning, drawing both laughter and tears from everyone in the room that night. Instead of a grand reception with twinkling lights and a packed dance floor, Grace and Lucas found themselves sitting on their apartment floor, still in their wedding clothes, their fingers laced together in the dim glow of their living room. Between them, Hugo lay comfortably, his head resting in Grace's lap, his warm presence filling the space with a quiet peace. The three of them shared takeout Chinese food, the scent of soy sauce and warm noodles wrapping around them like a familiar embrace. Each bite felt like a celebration, not of the chaos that had appended their day, but of the clarity it had brought. Lucas turned to Grace, his gaze filled with admiration, love etched into every line of his face. "This wasn't the perfect wedding," he said softly, his voice carrying both amusement and deep emotion, "but it was perfect for us." Grace smiled, running her fingers gently through Hugo's fur, her heart full because of him. She whispered, "He reminded us what love really means." The months after their unconventional wedding were a bittersweet blend of joy and heartache, a mix of gratitude and the quiet ache of what was to come. Hugo's treatment gave them precious time. On good days he was his old self, trotting behind Grace, wagging his tail for Lucas and enjoying walks in the park where their story began. But the tough days arrived too. Some mornings he struggled to rise. On those days Grace and Lucas adapted, staying close and cherishing every moment. One winter night, Grace sat with Hugo's head in her lap, his warmth comforting in the kitchen. Lucas prepared something warm. Grace whispered, "You've been the best boy, Hugo, the very best." A moment later Lucas stepped into the room carrying two steaming mugs. He took in the scene, his expression softening as he settled beside her. "How's he doing?" he asked, his voice low. Careful, Grace exhaled, offering a faint smile. "He's tired," she admitted, stroking Hugo's ears, "but he's here and that's what matters." Lucas wrapped an arm around her, pressing a kiss to the side of her head. "Said he's a fighter," he murmured, "just like you." The words settled in her chest, bittersweet and true. As the weeks passed, the good days became fewer, their weight heavier against the growing number of difficult ones. And then, on a soft spring morning, Hugo let them know it was time. The sky was clear, the air warm, as if nature itself had granted them a perfect farewell. They spent the day in the backyard under blooming trees, giving Hugo all the love he had given them. They fed him his favorite treats, whispered endless thank yous and I love yous, and held him close, their hands on his fur, their voices the last thing he heard as he peacefully drifted into his final sleep. That evening the house felt unbearably quiet. Grace sat at the kitchen table, staring at his empty bed, the absence of him a hollow ache in her chest. Lucas, steady as ever, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You gave him a life full of love, Grace," he said softly. "He always knew how much he meant to you." She nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "He taught me so much," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "about loyalty, about love. I miss him so much." Lucas squeezed her hand, offering quiet understanding, no empty reassurances. In the weeks that followed, they honored Hugo's memory, not just in words, but in the way they carried his love forward. They reminisced, laughed at his antics, kept his collar on the shelf by the door. His presence lingered in the spaces he had filled, in the habits they had formed around him, in the quiet love he had left behind. One afternoon, as Grace sorted through old photos, she paused at one from their wedding at the clinic. It captured a moment that now felt even more profound. She and Lucas exchanging vows, not looking at each other but at Hugo, who lay at their feet, watching them with quiet devotion. "Do you think he knew?" she asked softly, running her fingers over the image. Lucas looked at the picture, then at her, and nodded. "He knew exactly what he was doing," he said. "He reminded us what mattered most." Months later, on a quiet, rainy afternoon, Grace and Lucas found themselves walking through the familiar halls of the shelter, the very place where Grace had once found Hugo. The scent of clean straw and gentle rain mixed in the air, and the soft sounds of dogs stirring in their kennels echoed around them. Grace's heart ached with a longing she couldn't quite put into words. She wasn't looking to replace Hugo. No dog could ever take his place, but the absence of his presence left a space in her heart that felt ready to be filled with love again. As they passed kennel after kennel, The hopeful eyes of countless dogs met. There's each one searching for a home, a family, a second chance, and then at the very end of the row she saw him, a senior golden retriever, lay curled on a well-worn blanket, his golden fur peppered with silver around his muzzle, his deep brown eyes calm and knowing. He lifted his head, slightly resting his paws gently on the floor, as if waiting, as if he had always known this moment would come. Their eyes met, and in that instant Grace felt it, that same indescribable connection she had once felt all those years ago with Hugo, a silent understanding, a quiet recognition that went beyond words. This is him, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, her eyes welling with tears. He's the one. Lucas knelt beside her, reaching out carefully. The dog, his name was Lucky, according to the tag on his kennel, let out a slow, contented sigh as Lucas scratched gently behind his ears. His tail gave a small lazy wag, and in that moment there was no doubt Lucas smiled, nodding welcome to the family buddy. That night, as rain softly tapped against the window, Lucky curled up in Hugo's old bed, sighing as if settling into something familiar, safe. It was as though he understood the significance of the space he now occupied. Grace sat beside him, stroking his fur, her heart expanding in a way she hadn't thought possible. We're going to give you the best life, Lucky, she promised, her voice full of quiet conviction, because love like Hugo's wasn't meant to be kept, it was meant to be shared. Through Lucky they found healing, laughter, purpose, and the simple joy of coming home to a wagging tail and unconditional love. Every year on their anniversary, Grace and Lucas returned to the shelter, not just to remember but to give back. They brought donations, spent time with the older dogs, often overlooked, and reminded themselves of the love that had changed their lives. It was their way of honoring Hugo's legacy. Hugo had taught them something invaluable. Love isn't measured by time, but by how deeply you live it. And as Lucky slept peacefully beside them, breathing steady and warm, they knew Hugo's greatest gift had been this, teaching them that the heart always has room to love again. Did you enjoy this story? Did you also get emotional for Lucky? Let us know in the comments below. If you like the story, please subscribe to this channel and leave a like. Our hearts always have space to love once more. Thank you so much for listening. See you in the next video. Have a great day.